One effective family of techniques for reducing stereotype threat is to change the impact of the stereotype threat that exists. It's not necessarily aimed at the awareness or at the stereotypes themselves or how well the stereotypes resonate with the individual, but in how their mindset and outlook on the world changes how they perceive the stereotypes and how much those stereotypes impact their work. And we'll talk about a whole variety of techniques here. But in this little introduction, I just sort of want to introduce some of the idea there, as well as some things that you might not work as well as you'd expect. Remember when we were introducing stereotypes, we talked about this paper by Good, Aronson, Harder. And in this paper, we showed this graph where they had two situations, the normal situation, where they had given a calculus exam with no particular intervention, just the way they usually did. And then they did something to remove the stereotype threat and saw a dramatic increase in female scores. The action they took here, the intervention they did, was at the beginning of the test, they had a little page write-up about the test and why it was important that they try hard and so on. And for some of the students, that's all it said, was this is an important test that will tell you useful things about your future performance. For the others, they also stated that the test they had given had been tried with thousands of students and had shown no difference in male and female scores. A statement that, so they had this context for the exam where they told the female students the gender stereotype that usually operates against you won't operate against you here. And that caused this significant change. Now that technique of telling somebody stereotypes don't apply here has not been vetted in very many settings. It seems to work in sort of a single experiment situation here. It's unclear if it has any impact in a larger setting of a class or so on. And it's somewhat difficult to give honestly in many settings. So I wouldn't necessarily suggest that as a role model, but it is an evidence that you can create an intervention that changes people's, not their awareness of the stereotype, nor how much the stereotype applies to them, but how much they believe the stereotype impacts their performance in the particular task at hand. Another piece of this that is sort of evidence this exists, but perhaps not something you should use as you go forward, is this, the I can beat it mentality. Some subset of humans, when told you can't do things or people like you can't do this, will respond by, oh yeah, and then try even harder. It's not a very large slice of the population, and I haven't seen any studies that suggest it can be particularly trained in or trained away from individuals. Some people seem to have it and some don't. For whatever reason, by the time we look at them in college, it doesn't seem to be something we can do much about. But although there's few of these in general, they are many of the minority in most fields. Because this mentality tends to see minority status as a challenge. And so they'll tend to be overrepresented in many fields if it's a highly asymmetric population in the field. And this is worth understanding because it means that often role models and exemplars of minority groups that have entered computing aren't necessarily like the students. Right? Not like the majority. They don't necessarily relate well. Their path isn't necessarily a path others would take. Okay? And this is worth understanding that although their mentality has caused the stereotype forces to have a different than average effect, and it shows there is indeed mentalities that have that, they aren't necessarily the role models you want to bring in, at least not without some guidance, helping them understand that the people they're talking to are going through a struggle and aren't reacting to the struggle in the same way. So both of these examples are examples of techniques that show that indeed there is some difference in mentality that reduces the impact of stereotype threat. Although neither of these are perhaps the ones you want to model. In subsequent segments of this module, we'll talk about several mindsets that can be developed in your students that can reduce the impact of stereotype threat.